Good morning, News Talk 1330 WLBB. It's 8:30 on the news clock. Time for the Community Voice program, and I'm back here in the hot seat. Feels like it has been almost a week. We're just shy of a week of me not being on the air for political opinion. On every morning, of course, for local news, but political insight normally twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday. This week, due to oftentimes scheduling stuff, just wind up getting a couple days of the week. Wednesday and Thursday are the days this week. Normally Tuesday and Thursday, like I said before. But anyway, welcome to the program. Thanks for tuning in. And we got lots to talk about for today. And there's a presidential debate tonight. And in light of that, we will talk about that for a moment. Now, to be honest, school has been royally taking a lot of my time this semester. And I haven't had a whole lot of time to pay too much attention to national politics. You know, I catch little bits of it. I check out the Drudge Report occasionally, look at some local news media. I catch news on Yahoo, but honestly, have a lot going on. It's hard to pay attention to too much and coordinate school all at the same time. So long story short, apparently abortion and contraception is now one of the big topics at the national level again for some silly reason. Why we do this, I don't know, because we never, ever, ever, ever deal with contraception and abortion issues at the national level, historically speaking. So to elect a candidate based on his views on abortion is kind of a misnomer if you look at national policy. And I'm not saying that national policy will never reflect a candidate's opinion, views, whatever it is. I'm just saying it's kind of not a good way to approach politics, because history tells us that the abortion issue for the last 40 years that it's been an issue, 50 years almost that it's been an issue, has not been handled very much at the national level since Roe versus Wade. Anyway, so if you haven't heard, if you've been a hermit like me and you haven't heard some news, do recall this. I'm sure this was the big, and this is what started it all, was Obamacare has parts in it that call for requiring not churches but religious organizations, I assume Catholic hospitals, any other Catholic affiliated business, not necessarily a church, but like I said, a Catholic hospital requires these employers to cover contraceptives, even though it's against the religious beliefs of the ones being covered or the employers. So there's an assault here against the Constitution, is what the right is arguing, and somehow this topic has been spun into abortion and rights to contraception. It's gotten so complicated and muddy. It's honestly kind of angry, and Rick Santorum certainly isn't helping himself. I'm honestly finding it hard to believe that he's not dropped really far in the polls, because if he campaigns on this social conservatism shtick, it ain't happening. One, because the American people, by and large, don't care about social stuff. They care about economics when it comes down to it. And this social stuff just makes everybody angry. The country is largely divided on it. It's a very contentious, very polarized issue. But anyway, back to the topic of forcing employers to cover contraception. I'd like to point out that, from my understanding, birth control as a medication can be purchased over the counter for $15 to as much as you want to spend every month on birth control. If you want to get the ultra high-end birth control, it's probably a few $100s a month. But anywhere from $15 to $50 a month, you can buy it over the counter. Or maybe you may need the approval of a nurse practitioner, for example. I don't think that's terribly hard to get. So somehow the left is framing this as an argument about women's rights to protect their health. I wasn't aware that just because your insurance provider didn't provide you with contraception coverage that they're harming your health. I mean, if it was really a harm to your health, wouldn't it be in the insurance company's best interest to make sure that you stay healthy by providing for a $15 a month birth control pill? That's not a very big expense. Especially if the insurance company's cost is probably a lot less than the over-the-counter cost. So if it's really about women's health, I think someone operating a multi-billion-dollar company would probably figure it out that we should probably provide this if it really does reduce cost and improve the health of our consumers. So there's a Republican debate tonight in Arizona. That's one of the last ones, I believe. It's been a while since we've had one. It seems like we had one every other day for about a month and a half, and maybe I just haven't been paying attention, but they have another one tonight. It's in Arizona, and I imagine, based on the national news media, that abortion and contraception is going to be a big issue, and Santorum is going to stick to his social conservatism. He's a Catholic. And Newt Gingrich is a Catholic, too. I don't know where he stands on abortion, but Santorum is a lot more vocal about it. And he's one of the types who believes that abortion is off the limits, period. Now, I don't want to get into that issue, but so back to the Obamacare forcing employers to do things that they don't want to do. It goes against a constitutionally protected ability to practice your religion freely. The government should not force you to do anything that is against your religion. Now, that goes for businesses. It goes for... There's years of precedent that say that the government can't force you to do something that's against your religion, as long as you aren't harming anybody else. Now, it was a public opinion victory that Obama conceded forcing employers to pay for it. However, it was not a moral victory, the solution to this problem. Because all he did was turn around and say, well, okay, well, the employers aren't going to provide it because they don't like being forced to provide something. So we're going to force the insurance companies to provide for it. And again, we get to this whole principle that really there's two things going on here. Again, the first is the free exercise of religion. Only churches are left alone. But beyond the churchyard gate, your autonomy disappears. Religious autonomy, at least. Every other religious institution must bow to the state when it comes to this issue. There's also an assault on free enterprise, too. To solve his own political problem, the president instead wants to order a private company to enter into a contract for the provision of certain services, all of which must be without charge. It is a breathtaking power grab. And supposedly it's some logical extension of Washington's takeover of the private system of medical care, a system which it already largely controls. Now, we've gotten so used to the status quo, we think we have somewhat of a free market healthcare system. We don't, and we haven't for years and years and years and years. Economically, if you look at, and this is a brief side note, economically, if you look at our system, France's system, Canada's system, Britain's system, they're all third-party payer. Everybody gets care. Not everybody has insurance or methods of payment. And healthcare economics is a pretty interesting topic as well. But again, lastly, there's an assault on individual autonomy. Every citizen without insurance is now ordered to buy it, again under penalty of law. And this so-called individual mandate is now before the Supreme Court. And it's iffy as to whether or not they're actually going to contest it or not. Because now we have the issue of, well, no one is being forced yet, so we can't decide whether or not it's unconstitutional. And it makes me wonder if this is a political play on the part of the Supreme Court in order to not affect President Obama in his upcoming election. Because if Obamacare gets defeated, it's hard to imagine it not being a big blow to his presidency and his chances at re-election. Under Obamacare, the state treats private insurance the way it does other government-regulated monopolies and utilities. It determines everything that is important. Insurers, by definition, as insurance. What is insurance anyway? It's a policy to protect yourself from risk. That's what health insurance is. It protects you from risk. In case you have a heart attack, in case you get hit by a car. Well, the government doesn't want it to work that way anymore. The risk ratios are now going to be decreed by Washington, and this is nationalization in all but name. It is a form of socialism. Now, the government will not own the means of production, which is the definition of socialism, but it will be darn near close enough. What is the difference between the government owning the means of distribution and determining how it's distributed, or the government directing everything in the economy? You can command an economy through regulation. You can command an economy through ownership. How is it not socialistic? When the insurer is turned into merely a middleman subject to state control and presidential whim. Many people on the right and the left don't like the term socialism. Well, quite a few on the left do, probably. And everybody likes their own socialism to a degree, too. It just depends on how you want to frame the argument. If we look back to 2010, when all of this Obamacare stuff looked back, we were looking ahead to how it's going to work. It energized a lot of people. It was powerful enough to really deliver for President Obama in political form. Yet 2 years later, as a consequence of the overreach of Obamacare, we see what's going on today. What happens is the opposition party, the Republicans, whose responsibility it is to make the opposition argument, aren't making it very well. Republicans have control of the House. What have they done to defund Obamacare? Every presidential challenger in the GOP debate tonight has said that they will repeal Obamacare on day one. Well, how do you do that? Do you overreach your executive power and declare an executive order? And just say, nope, can't do it. Sorry, I'm going to reach outside my constitutional boundaries and I'm going to be the legislator now. Or decide not to enforce it, which is legislating in a sense. But who on the stage is making the case for why? So when you watch the debate tonight, and Obamacare and abortion and contraception are the issues, which I'm sure they will be, go beyond the will and ask the why. We'll be back after the break. I promise we aren't talking about this the rest of the show. Topic change is next. I promise. It is a contentious issue. Don't want to get into it. But just had to catch you up on my take on it and the whole Obamacare debate and how the national opinion gets swayed so much that we're talking about religious liberty here. We're not remotely talking about access to contraceptives. And it gets spun into women's rights for access to health care and all this other nonsense. Stay focused. Pay attention. I know I have enough trouble with that, but I have an excuse. I've got ADD. We are back after the break. The program brought to us by Tanner Health System. Adam Uglum here hosting the program today. Well, yesterday was President's Day, but today is actually the anniversary of George Washington's birth, so it's a good day to remember the contribution that he made to our great republic. So why is it that we remember George Washington so highly? Why is it that the right and the left don't have much to disagree on with George Washington? Well, I imagine a lot of both the right and the left don't know enough about him, for starters, is one key thing. But the guy wasn't beholden to a party. He's the only president who didn't have a political party. As a matter of fact, he condemned them. He said we should not have parties. And most of the founders agreed, but we wound up with him anyway. James Madison in the Federalist Papers goes at great length to warn us against factions and how we should control them. You can't eliminate them, but what do you do to ease their excesses? George Washington was the man who established the American Republic. He led the Revolutionary Army against the British Empire. He served as our first president, and most importantly, he stepped down from that power. There were no constitutional limitations on how many terms you could serve as president, something the Anti-Federalists were very much opposed to in the writing of the Constitution. George Washington set the precedent for 2 terms, and every president served 1 or 2 terms until FDR. In an era, especially with guys like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Mason even, out of Virginia, Alexander Hamilton, all these brilliant men, in an era where he's surrounded like Benjamin Franklin. And really, we had brilliant people that founded this country. It's undeniable. George Washington was not the deepest thinker. He never wrote a book, much less a long essay. As a matter of fact, he often asked Alexander Hamilton to write opinions for him, especially when he was president. However, Washington made the ideas of the American founding very much real. He was incarnate liberal and Republican ideas in his own person. The two are one and the same. The way we use the term liberal today, I say this all the time, is not how we should. Liberal's a good thing. We're all liberals. We all like freedom. Washington gave those ideals their effect through the American Revolution, through the Constitution, through his successful presidency, and by his departure from office. Well, what's so great about leaving office? Why should we remember George Washington for leaving office? Surely it matters a lot more what a president actually does in office, but think about other military commanders and revolutionary leaders before then. To name a few, Caesar, Nero, Napoleon, all of them seized power by military force, ran countries, and oftentimes they held that power until death or until they were defeated militarily. John Adams said he was the best actor of presidency we have ever had. Indeed, Washington was a person who was very conscious of his reputation. He worked all of his life to develop his character and his image. He was truly the most noble president in our history. In our own time, Joshua Micah Marshall writes of America's first president, it was all a put-on, an act. Marshall misses the point. Washington understood that character is something you develop. He learned from Aristotle, as many of the men of this time did read Aristotle. It was the period of the Great Enlightenment. They read Descartes, Aristotle, Locke. They read these guys. They read that good conduct arises from habits, that in turn can only be acquired by repeated action and correction. And Tocqueville would later on agree. Habits of the heart, mores, is what Tocqueville would go on to call them. We are what we repeatedly do. Indeed, the word ethics comes from ethos, a Greek word for habit. We say something is second nature because it's not actually natural. It's a habit we've developed. When you refer to doing something as second nature, it's something that you've developed. It's not something that's first nature, but it is a habit. And the things Washington did was establish the habits, the precedent, we could call it, for our country. Almost all of the men involved with the development and the founding of the country read Greek philosophers and Roman statesmen. They studied what made democracies work, what made republics work and fail in history, because traditionally democracies and republics didn't have a very good track record. So how do you solve those problems? And what values did George Washington express? Who was he? Was he a farmer or was he a businessman? Was he an enthusiast for commerce? As a man of enlightenment, George Washington was deeply interested in scientific farming. His letters on Mount Vernon are longer than letters on running the government. Washington was very much a leave me alone kind of guy. But he had a big problem with saying no, too. Anytime the country needed him, they would go to him. Washington would say no, but eventually he would say yes. And what's interesting, here's an interesting fact. By 1975, 4 years after the Constitution was ratified, more people worked at Mount Vernon than in the entire executive branch of the federal government. That's hard to believe, isn't it? More people worked at Mount Vernon for George Washington than, and I'm sure slaves are included in this statistic, but it's a little irrelevant. One very large farm in Virginia had more employees than the executive branch. How far have we come in 200 years? From a government that all of its employees are smaller than that of a farm to one where our federal government is now in the millions? It's been an interesting 200 years. We'll be back after the break to talk a little more about George Washington, since today is his birthday. Good morning, and we're back. We've got about 6 minutes left in the program. Hard to believe that's all that's left. So, and again, today's is the anniversary of George Washington's birth. It's often confused that yesterday, actually, which is President's Day, is George Washington's birth, but I believe it's actually Abraham Lincoln's birthday. Why? I don't know. I probably should have been responsible and figured out exactly why yesterday is President's Day. But to get back to George Washington and looking at his Republican values, and when I say Republican, I don't mean anything like the Republican Party. Republicanism and Republican Party, two completely different things. In a famous letter that George Washington wrote to the Jewish congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, I first read this last semester in my American Political Thought class. Very interesting letter. Brief, as I mentioned, George Washington is, which is kind of nice. He hailed the liberal policy of the United States on religious freedom as worthy of emulation by other countries. In his letter, he explains it is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it were indulgence to one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights, for happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens. It was the golden rule. It sounds kind of silly, but it really is the principle upon which the country was founded. Do no harm unto others, because you would not wish them to do harm unto you. Now, we can argue about that all day, but that idea is there. George Washington believed in a republic of free citizens, with a government based on consent and established to protect the rights of life, liberty, and property of individuals, not groups. It was the first time in history that we had a government based on the individual, where we didn't have an exalted class of senators, even though they called that a democracy, or an exalted class of politicians. Suffrage was more universal than it had ever been. Yes, I know that blacks couldn't vote in the South. Yes, I know women couldn't vote in many states. In some states they could vote early on in the Republic. But still, suffrage was expanded larger to anyone, larger, spread more widely than it ever had been before. You know, if we go back to the French Revolution, where we had the establishment of the French Commune in the 1820s, early 1820s, I think. Suffrage went from about a percentage of the population to closer to 10% of the population. It was a huge expansion of suffrage. And when Alexis de Tocqueville came to the country and observed our republic after 40 years of progress, he examined that never has a country ever extended the power of government to the hands of so many. He has never seen a classless country in all of his travels. There are vast arrays of both rich and poor, but none of them seem to be bothered by it. They live amongst each other with no quarrels. There are no clear, distinct classes. Who is rich one day may be poor the next. Who is poor one day may be rich the next, Tocqueville would observe. That is the kind of country that democracy creates. And democracy, as we've seen it in history, is not like what we saw in America, or what we see in America, where the power of the government is, the net is cast so widely. Interestingly enough, unlike FDR, Washington derived his abhorrence of kingship, even for himself. I mean, wouldn't you like to elect a president or have a president who didn't like being president? I mean, it's just kind of an interesting thing to think about. Maybe he'd leave you alone. A famous writer, Gary Wills, calls George Washington a virtuoso of resignations. He gave up power not once but twice. At the end of the Revolutionary War, when he resigned his military commission and returned to Mount Vernon, and again at the end of his second term as president. He didn't have to step down. He would have been reelected in a landslide. George Washington was one of the most famous, most popular politicians ever. If you can call him a politician. The country loved him. He won the Revolutionary War. He refused all of the prodding for a third term. George Washington was an old and tired man by this point. But in doing so, he set a standard for American presidents that lasted until the presidency of FDR, as I said earlier. FDR had a taste for power like you would not believe. Give the last word to Washington's great adversary, King George III. The king asked his American painter Benjamin West what Washington would do after winning independence. And West replied, "They say he will return to his farm. If he does that," the incredulous monarch said, "he will be the greatest man in the world."